Hi everyone, my name is Nick Marshall and I'm the Manager of Exhibitions and Programs at the George Eastman Museum. Welcome to today's virtual In Focus talk with University of Rochester predoctoral fellow at the Eastman Museum, Clara Auclair, who will be giving us a behind-the-scenes look at their work researching and cataloging the Francis Doublier collection at Eastman Museum. For those not familiar with our In Focus series, they're deep dives into various aspects of the museum that are often going on behind closed doors. These talks afford us the opportunity to present these stories and to give the public a kind of a glimpse of that myriad of work and different research projects that's going on here. Our next virtual talk is actually part of our Future Present series. That's on April 22nd at 6 p.m. with artist Sam Cannon. Definitely encourage you to attend that if you're available. You can get your tickets for that program on our website. If you have questions at any point throughout today's talk, please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At the end of Clara's talk, we'll go through as many of your questions that we have time for. The chat function, which I see some of you have already been using, is open. Definitely welcome people communicating through that, saying hello, letting us know where you're tuning in from. But if you do have questions specifically for Clara, please submit them through the Q&A. It's just easier for us to monitor that way. If you, and like I said, if you want to use the chat to say hello, that's great too. We are recording today's webinar and we'll be putting it on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So if you'd like to go back and watch again or share with others, you're able to access it along with our other webinars and video content through YouTube. And you should be receiving an email in about a week with a link to this, to today's program once it's live. We have the closed captioning function on Zoom turned on, but if you'd like to turn it off, you can click on the CC icon, either at the bottom or top of your screen, I believe, and you should be able to disable it. And I do just want to note that while Zoom's closed captioning is a great feature to be able to have, it sometimes is not the most accurate at interpretation, particularly with some technical language. And with that, I'll turn it over to Clara, who is joining us from the moving image department right now. Maybe can talk a little bit about where they're at specifically. So I'll turn it over to you, Clara.
Sure, thank you, Nick. Yeah, I'm in the screening room where the Celsius classes happen, and I'll talk about what I have behind me, of course, during my talk. So thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. I've been working on the Doublier collection for quite some time now, so I'm extremely excited to be able to talk about some of its highlights with you today. What I particularly enjoy about this collection is that not only does it teaches us a lot about Francis Doublier, about early film history, but it also gives us some hints on George Eastman Museum institutional history. And I hope to be able to convey some of that to you today. So I'll be starting by giving you an overview of the collection and its history at the museum. Then I will give you some context on Francis Doublier. And finally, I'll go over some of the films from his collections. So Francis Doublier was an avid film collector, very invested in the preservation of film heritage and also in his heritage within film history. As one of the early Lumiere cameraman, he considered himself a pioneer, and he was recognized as such by the motion picture industry. Towards the end of his life, I'm unsure of exactly when he started this, but he had his own private museum inside his basement. Those are pictures from a 1944 article by Irving Browning, published in The American Photographer, where we can see Doublier in his museum. He gave many lectures towards the end of his life on the early days of cinema throughout New York and New Jersey. So that would be in the 1930s and 1940s. And shortly after his death in 1948, Kodak bought Doublier's film collection and apparatus collection from Francis Doublier's wife, Louise Doublier, born Bessanet. So the collection of films and apparatus was meant to enrich Eastman historical photographic collection and was advertised as early as 1949 as one of the important teaching collection from the newly opened museum, along with Gabriel Kromer's photographic collection, for example. And the entire film collection was then officially donated by Eastman Kodak Company to the museum in 1972, the same year than the museum gave the Kromer collection to the then Kodak gave the Kromer collection to the museum, sorry. So the Francis Doublier collection presents a very interesting case of provenance research, which is in short, the study of the historical origins of museum artifacts within institutions. Because even if there are records of an original purchase and film lists, the films don't exist as a collection anymore. And this is not due to bad housekeeping, but simply because museum standards and priorities change. So in 1949, the Eastman Museum had one of the earliest film archives along with its photographic archive. So they were creating preservation practices that are still evolving today. And films were not preserved as a collection, but for their individual value. So they were individually cataloged and separated by format and stock for safety and to optimize storage facilities. So the information contained on original inventories did not necessarily make it to the succession of internal cataloging systems throughout the years, at least not at the item level, and the link to Doublier sometimes faded. So when we're searching the film titles from those original lists in the current database, the reference to Doublier is seldom reported, save for a good amount of the original Lumière prints, and of course for his own cinematographic work, Cinematic Beginnings. Yet it doesn't mean that the information doesn't exist anymore. Those papers, those original film lists are in the museum's paper historical collection. And the James Card and George Pratt card catalog also refers to Doublier, either by mentioning his full name or by annotating a small D at the top right-hand corner of the card. So those were the museum's first cataloging system, if you will. As I mentioned, Kodak bought not only Doublier's films, but his technical collection as well. Technical equipment as well. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about this part of the collection as much because I haven't had the chance to research really the technical collection with the technical collection team here. I've been more concentrating on the films and the papers, but we do know that the cinematograph in the Eastman Museum collection is Doublier's. What I'm curious about is if Kodak bought more than his cinematograph. And for example, this Lumière projector that is shown in the Irving Browning article, I wonder if Doublier's Lumière projector is also in the collection. But that's a talk for another day, perhaps. So to come back to the films, we have two lists. One from 1948 and a second inventory from 1955. And combined, those lists amount to a total of 114 films. But that's not all. In 1944, at the death of Louise Doublier, their son Edward sent Doublier's paper archive to Eastman Kodak, and the papers are now part of the moving image paper collections. A note about this paper collection, it's comprised of some of it are about Doublier. There are some Doublier correspondence from Doublier and to Doublier, some photographs, a lot of newspaper clippings, his obituary, for example, but most of the papers on Doublier seem to have been constituted by his family and not so much by Doublier himself. And the bulk of this paper collection, which is 7 boxes, is about the early days of cinema and the early days of sound film. And they're actually more about the work of Eugène Augustin Laos. They were originally scrapbooks, research papers, like you can see represented on the right of the screen here. And what's interesting is that the Smithsonian, the American History Museum in Washington, have the exact same scrapbooks. And so my hypothesis is that actually those were Laos scrapbooks, that he documented his own research and his place within film history. And in order to preserve his heritage, he deposited one with the Smithsonian, and he entrusted his friend Francis Doublier with another exemplar of his scrapbooks. And that's why they ended up in his papers. That's my hypothesis, of course. So the Doublier's paper collection preserved at the George Eastman Museum offers an interesting paradox, because we are confronted with a voluminous archive of technical and personal documents, which in turn gives us very little information about on the bulk of the life of Francis Doublier, and especially his career as in the film industry as a laboratory technician. It mostly describes Eugène Laos' career. The Doublier collection at the museum then constitutes three main ensembles preserved in three different areas of the museum: the technical collection, the film prints, and the paper collection. So my work as a fellow so far has concentrated on the film collection, and I've been trying to reconstitute this collection. I've been trying to cross-reference the documentation, the available documentation at the museum, inspecting the prints, see how they were cataloged, if I could assert that they were actually Doublier's prints, and add more information to the current cataloging system. So it is important for historical and legal reasons to establish the provenance of museum objects to the item levels. But I also believe that something can be learned from the reconstitution of this collection. The ensembles of films created by Doublier through the act of collecting is meaningful and gives us clues to better understand his career and his investment in the preservation of film history. So some of you might wonder by now, who was this Francis Doublier? Why was he in the United States? And what don't we know about him that this collection can tell us? So first and foremost, and Doublier, what Doublier is known for is he was one of the first Lumiere cameramen. He was born in 1878 in Lyon, France. And he started as an apprentice in the laboratories of the Lumière factories in 1894. In fact, Doublier entered the motion picture industry because of a family drama. His father, Louis-Étienne Doublier, was killed during a work accident at the Lumière factory in 1890. And it is as a compensation that Lumière offered to hire all the children of the widow. The family had 6 children then, and we do find traces of at least 2 sisters and 1 brother having worked for the Lumière. Outside of census data, I haven't found any traces of the sisters, but in the George Eastman Museum collection, there is a postcard representing Gabrielle Doublier with Henri Lumière. And actually, it's a picture probably taken while Gabrielle Doublier received the Légion d'honneur in 1954 for his work for the motion picture industry. Henri Lumière petitioned to have Gabrielle Doublier receive this honor. He was also a laboratory technician, so he had a parallel career to his brother in France. Those familial ties are important as they illustrate one trait of France's industrial landscape at the beginning of the 20th century. So if the personal history of Doublier is quite exceptional, it starts with a tragic death. It is very common, actually, for family members to work for the same employer and thus across several generations. This was true of early French film companies like Lumière or Pathé. And in fact, this familial network is going to partly populate New Jersey with French men and women in the early 1910s. I'll come back to that, but one last thing that I want to highlight about the importance of genealogical research and census data is that those records, so this is a census from Lyon from 1906, very often are the only trace left of women's work for the film industry. So for example, here in this 1906 census in Lyon, we find Francis Doublier's mother, Jenny, still living at the same address with his sister Philippine, who works for Lumiere. And right above her, we see another female employee. And if we go through those records, we find a lot of traces of those women having worked for the film industry. And often they are the only traces. But to come back to Doublier and his career with Lumiere, on December 28, 1895, he assists Charles Moisson at the Lumière screening of the Grand Café with Jacques Ducombe. So he always likes to tell this because he was there at one of the first Lumière screenings. That's what makes him really a pioneer. He was here from the start. And from 1896 to 1902, Doublier was sent throughout Europe and then Asia to promote the cinematograph. This information is the most cited by Doublier himself, his family, the trade press, and historians. His identity as the Lumière cameraman is what kept him alive within the historical narrative, even though Doublier participated in the development and industrialization of cinema on many accounts. I'm not going to give all the details of his travels for Lumière. Jean-Claude Seguin, if you're interested, gives a very detailed account of Doublier's career for Lumière. And for the Anglophones, Irving Browning in the 1944 article that I referenced also give a very good account of his career for Lumière. Two facts, though, that he always liked to put forward, and that is connected to this object that is behind me, is his career in Russia for Lumiere. Because in 1896, Doublier films the Tsar's coronation with Charles Moisson. There is a print of this at the museum. And he's present at the tragedy of Odinsky Plain, where thousands of people were trampled to death because they were trying to get souvenirs from the coronation. And Doublier claims to have filmed the accident, but that his camera was confiscated by the police and the film destroyed. Browning mentioned that him and his assistant were in fact arrested, and then the French consul had to plead for their release. So this memory was very important for Doublier. He references it many times in lectures and interviews, and he's often quoted by the press as a sensational fact about his life. He collected news clippings about this too. Another anecdote, interesting anecdote about him, that he is also famous for having engineered one of the first fake documentary when he was touring Ukraine by pretending to screen images of the Dreyfus affair, while they were in fact images of military parades that he edited together. There was also a beach scene, I think, that he pretended that it was the island where Dreyfus was imprisoned. And he confessed to have had an enormous success with his reel until he was called out by the Spectator, who recalled that the Dreyfus affair happened before the cinematograph was invented. So after that, he swore that he would never show the print again. And I don't think anybody found the print. But he cherishes this anecdote probably as much as his Russian narrow escape from death and the police. And proof that this Russian career was very important to him is like in this frame of one of his films, Pioneer Days of the Motion Pictures. We can see that he posed with a poster, a Russian poster. And when I saw this film frame, I actually sent it to Peter Bagroff, the curator of the Moving Image Department, who is Russian, to know if that had anything to do with his Lumiere career. And little did I know at the time that the poster was actually in the collection. And that's why I have it here to emulate a little bit this frame. And we were able to attest the provenance of this poster thanks to this frame, because Nancy Kaufman actually then researched the collection for the frame. I don't know if you can see well the poster behind me. It has been restored and put on Japanese paper, so it did not fit the frame anymore, but we don't know when it was restored. but the frame was still in the photographic collection here. So Nancy Kaufman was able to retrieve it, and now they're back together. So this is a little bit of an anecdote of how things get found in a museum. And this poster was actually indeed an advertisement for Lumiere in 1899, and it's a provincial town in a provincial town in Russia. But to come back to Doublier's Lumiere, the end of Doublier's Lumiere career. So in 1902, Doublier was tired of image hunting, and he would have famously said to Lumiere that he had seen and filmed enough sites, and that surely there wouldn't be more to film after that. So he wanted to learn a trade and settle. This anecdote is particularly appreciated by the American press, who often quotes this Frenchman who has never been to Hollywood and thought that film was over in 1900. He went back to working in the laboratory and before leaving for the United States. He's sent to the United States by Lumiere to open a photographic manufactured paper plant, plates as well, in Burlington, Vermont. And he's going to spend 9 years in Vermont, too early. And he's going to marry his wife, Louise Bessonet. He's actually going to come back in 1903 to France and bring Louise to the US with him. They're going to have 3 sons. But in 1911, Lumiere is forced out of business and has to close the Vermont plant. At the time, Doublier was supposed to go back to France and to Lyon to continue working for Lumiere, but he's offered work opportunities in Fort Lee, New Jersey by film distributor and producer Jules Brelatour, who was then distributing Lumiere stock to the growing independent film industry in Fort Lee, New Jersey. After a visit to Fort Lee, he accepted a position as a head of negative department at the newly opened Auclair studio. To give a little bit of context about Fort Lee in the 1910s, it was a really exciting and growing place for the film industry in the US right before World War I. Film production companies were trying to escape the confines of Manhattan and set studios in New Jersey to be able to have more space, but also to film outdoors and enjoy the scenes, the woods and the cliffs in Fort Lee, for example. And it was also a place of choice for foreign companies to settle, because towards World War I, as the American film industry was growing, they were trying to fight back against importation of foreign film and French film. And they were saying that they wanted American subjects to try to push back against foreign film importation. And one way to fight back against this for foreign film companies and French film companies, which is really my subject here, was to set their own production plants in New Jersey to be able to produce American subject with American actors, but keep their technical staff and technical company. So they would import actually a lot of workers from France. And Doublier is going to integrate this network. He was in the US for longer, since he arrived as early as 1902. But Jules Brelatour was probably looking for people who are able to speak French to work in those companies, hire Doublier, and then he's going to spend his whole life working for first French companies and then American companies in New Jersey. So he's going to spend his life working in film laboratories, first Auclair, Solax, Paragon. He actually builds the Paragon studio, Eclipse, Hurligraph, Major Films Laboratory. And by the way, the history of Fort Lee has been written about by Richard Skozarski, and the history of this fight against French film importation by Richard Abel. Doublier had mostly managerial positions. He did very well with his life, actually, but we lose trace of the chronology towards the end of his life. It is much less documented, for example, than his Lumiere career. I'm not going to go over the details of the chronology here, but if you're interested, I'm happy to communicate a more detailed biography. what we're interested here, what interests me here is really when he started his film collection. And we don't know exactly, it's hard to pin down, but there is this little piece of evidence in a Moving Picture World article in 1922, where Doublier answers an ad for a film identification because it happened to be a Lumiere film. And I'm just going to read this little text that he sends a journal to you, because you can really read his excitement in this. So I'm going to read it now. When reading your esteemed magazine of December 23rd, my heart leaped with joy when I saw on page 716 at the bottom of the sheet the film beneath, which was a notation, "Who can identify the two films shown here?" It brought back to my mind many pleasant memories, one of which was the excitement of being almost trampled upon by the horses that could hardly be stopped in front of the camera. This picture was taken 27 years ago in 1895 by Monsieur Lumière, Lyon, France, and was entitled "The Charge of the French Cuirassier." I was the assistant to the cameraman who showed this picture. We showed these pictures with several others, but always kept this with one other, the arrival of the train in La Ciotat, for the last, as they had the real punch. The people who sat close to the screen fell back in their seats when the horses made their mad rush toward them on the screen. At that time, we did not change the program as often as we do today, and I showed this picture throughout Europe and Asia for 3 years. So we don't know really if this would have prompted him to collect more film and to show more Lumière films. But from the mid-30s and for the last 10 years of his life and career, he dies in 1948, Doublier gives a lot of lectures, sometimes organized by Merritt Crawford and Irving Browning, sometimes in conjunction with early sound inventor Eugène Augustin Laoste. And he joined several associations, the Society for Motion Pictures Engineers, the Picture Pioneers, and the National Board of Reviews of Motion Pictures. And he gives at least yearly lectures at galas and conferences organized by these associations, local movie clubs, and New York State universities. And most of his lectures are accompanied by film demonstrations. And in the lectures, it's always said that he was showing original prints. So there are traces of this work and of this network of people in the paper collection. Here we have a letter from Eugène Laoste dated from 1935, so just a month before Laoste's death, to Mrs. Doublier. They were organizing an outing at Greenwood Lake. And there is also a very precious film that I found last week, and Gordon Nelson was kind enough to digitize so I could show it to you for this talk. And it is footage that Doublier shot at Laoste's house. The location was properly identified thanks to Richard Skozowski and Chris Mijureski. I don't know how they did it, but really it's impressive. And so it was located in Bloomfield, New Jersey. And I think it's a very good testimony of the kind of relationship that those people had and their investment really in film history. So I'm gonna play the film for you. It's only 3 minutes. It's silent. And it was from a 16mm film, but the 35mm negative also exists in the collection. It just wasn't as complete as a 16mm. It was also a negative. That's why you see that the edges are black. Here, the image is reversed. So you can see here, this is Eugène Laoste. And as I said, this was shot in 1935. So it's a precious document because it was shot just probably a few months before his death in June 1935. This is the dog apparently is named Bear. That was the inscription in on the leader. And here you have Francis Doublier on the left, Laost in the middle, and Merritt Crawford, who was a film historian, who collaborated with Doublier. So it seems like they are reenacting kind of their meeting, but it's hard to know who introduced who. Still Laost, still Merritt Crawford. Merritt Crawford actually edited Cinematic Beginnings, one of the films that I'll talk about. Francis Doublier. And another reason why I particularly like this film, and especially the 16mm footage, is that it shows Mrs. Doublier here, Louise, and Mrs. Laost, who helped their husband throughout their lives. And we also don't have a lot of images of them, so it's very rewarding to have images of them. And candid home movies are always very touching. French Kiss. And that's it. So there are very few home movies actually in the film collection. There is another one that was shot also in 1935 on 16mm this time. There is a negative and prints of this, where Doublier and his sons, Doublier, his wife and his sons were in Manhattan to see the arrival of the Normandy, the SS Normandy. There were actually some scenes shot on the Normandy. But the majority of the films I'm going to present an overview here are mostly fiction films and technical films. I'm going to talk about the nitrate titles preserved at the Louis B. Mayer Conservation Center, because that's what I've worked most with. I started with the nitrate titles because a lot of the titles were still unidentified, and I had the most experience with research on early film prints. I also wanted to start with 6 scans that are still titled Doublier Collection in the current catalog, in the hope to match some of the titles from the original acquisition list. This was mostly successful and generated exciting finds, but most of all, the weeks spent carefully inspecting those nitrate rolls did give me a first overviews of Doublier's personality as a collector. Most titles from this collection, from this section of the collections, are fragments or duplicates and can be separated in 6 categories: the Lumiere films, fragments used for his documentary Cinematic Beginnings, sound and color, travelogues and newsreel, early fictions, and duplicates. I'm only going to go over a few of these categories with you today. Doublier actively collected Lumiere prints, as can be expected, as he cultivated his identity as a pioneer. it is highly probable that some of the prints currently existing in the George Eastman Museum collection were prints Doublier himself exhibited in the late 1890s and early 1900s while on location in Russia and East Asia. He kept his projector and most likely would have kept some prints as well or collected the prints later. Doublier was very much invested in the preservation of early film artifacts, but also of the experience of projection, perhaps even more than the content of the films themselves. The many articles introducing or reviewing his lectures often mention Doublier accompanied them with demonstrations of his Lumière projector and the screening of original film prints. In that regard, his practice as a collector and former projectionist, while participating of a growing movement advocating for the preservation of the film medium, remains quite exceptional. Indeed, Doublier was already emphasizing and showcasing film in its materiality and as an historical event to be experienced in the moment, in the here and now of the projection, which is what scholars and curators like Akiuzai or Alexander Horvath have been advocating for the past 20 years as film progressively shifted to digital screening. So I think it's very meaningful in the House of the Nitrate Picture Show that this collection is preserved here. Doublier's careful attention to the historicity of his collection is also displayed in the care he put in its housing. By chance, a few rolls have survived in their original casing, and the archivists processing his collection were careful to preserve the pieces of paper containing Doublier's handwritten inscription on several fragments. Each print was numbered and described by Doublier. We also have the original cans. I don't know how much you're going to be able to see here, but this is one of his own film, Cinematic Beginnings, the 16 millimeter prints that have been preserved. He always recorded details identifying the film and their historical importance. For example, number 10 is a Lumière original, here on the left. Positive representing Loubet. It is the film, the Lumière film Inauguration des Palais, 1900. And number 8 here reads Film 1895, sample of that shown as the Society of Photography of France. Sample here indicates that the film is a copy, not an original print. The importance of the artifact relying on its link to the program of one of the first Lumière private projection in June 1895, where Doublier was present. So the Lumière prints from the Doublier collection, at least the ones that currently exist in the catalogue and that have been preserved, are the only films where acquisition information was retained in the cataloging records. Because of Doublier's own association with Lumière, the stronger connection between former owner and its artifact was recorded and withstood through time and the periodical re-evaluation of cataloging practices. But the majority of the film materials from the 6 cans preserved under Doublier collection are film elements Francis Doublier collected and prepared for the production of his film about the advent of film and film projection, Cinematic Beginnings. The documentary aims at retracing the history of the birth of film. Doublier alternates between technical demonstrations and film clips, going over pre-cinema artifacts and all the inventions that led to the cinematograph. That's why there are a lot actually of film clips in his collection too, because there were film clips he collected for his film Cinematic Beginnings. There are early Edison prints, actually some early biograph negative too, as well as some Méliès prints. In the film, Doublier does not include his role as a cameraman or laboratory technician, yet he's not absent of the frame. His name and status, Francis Doublier, pioneer Lumière cameraman, proudly opens the credit title, and his portrait at the center of the Finis card beautifully closes his film. Doublier was in fact working on several projects and constantly re-editing his film from the mid-30s to the end of his life. None of the images outside of the intertitles that survive in the latest versions of Cinematic Beginnings were in fact shot by Francis Doublier. Cinematic Beginnings is a montage documentary in which Doublier appropriated earlier educational films and images to produce his own historical version of the birth of film. And the majority of the film demonstrations of pre-cinema artifacts and of the cinematograph came from an unidentified Pathé educational film from 1925 that you can see here in the center, the tinted print that Doublier duplicated. But he replaced the original French titles for English ones, carefully crafting his text to keep advocating for the French origins of film projection. The emphatic tone of the intertitles illustrated here, where the Lumière brothers freed film from its prison by offering film projection to the whole world, aligns with Doublier's career as a Lumière exhibitor and salesman. His tone here is the one of the bonimenteur, the person who was accompanying silent film projection. Overall, the first two categories presented here, Lumière and the materials he collected for his films, are only a continuation of the portrait Doublier crafted for himself throughout his life, and that has survived through the official channels of history. This is his legend. If those fragments are the easiest to grasp because they correspond exactly to the discourse he was building, they are not representative of the entirety of the films he collected. The last three categories I created to classify his film introduce other aspects of his life that only survived here as a group of collected images. To archivists and film scholars working with early film prints, winding through a nitrate color print is an exceptionally rare thrill. The aura surrounding the quality and vibrancy of the color, when seen directly on the nitrate base, is shared in a murmur from archivist to archivist. There is something extremely intimate in the close proximity with an object that is meant to be projected. The color on the print itself, if experienced directly on a film bench, will be different from its mediation through the projector, from its mediation through the projector's light when seen on a screen. Early color prints are prized holdings of film archives, for they are rather rare, often beautiful, and offer opportunities for preservation projects. Early color processes have gathered a lot of attention in the recent years and engendered many historical and technical publications. This spectacular aspect of film preservation was not lost on Doublier, who collected a variety of color processes from applied color or on hand-color Pathé print, for example, tinted and toned films, and two-color experiments such as Fox color, Kelly color, and illustrated here, the last two, Brewster color. However, and partly because of their mesmerizing aspect and historical significance, those color prints have more circulated within and outside of the archive, rendering the task of identifying the prints coming from Doublier impossible. Indeed, first Kodak and then the curators of the George Eastman Museum have also actively collected examples of film color artifacts, and it is difficult to trace the provenance of each individual prints with precision. So for example, the Brewster color prints, there are only 2 Brewster color prints, but it's hard to say which one of the 2 was coming from Doublier. But for most color processes, there is way more than 2 examples in the George Eastman Museum collection, and it's often difficult to determine with precision which one comes from Doublier. But in the film list, for example, especially if we don't have a precise film title, if we just have a Pathé and hand-colored print, it could be anyone, it could be really anything. But the presence of early color experiments in the Doublier collection raised another hypothesis, especially the 1930 color test. Working in film laboratories in the 1930s, Doublier was necessarily involved in the processing of this color test, especially considering his work experience and taste for research and innovation. Existence of color prints in his own collection could be a testament of his laboratory work. It definitely shows a continued involvement in cinema's developing technologies and processes. But if color prints fascinate for their sensible nature, early optical sound experiments have received very little attention in comparison. Contrary to color, they are not immediately accessible and require mediation. One cannot hear the content of the soundtrack by merely looking at it, and the technology needed to access and read the content of said soundtrack is either unknown or unavailable. Digital technologies might solve some of these obstacles and allow us to finally access their content, but they require preservation and scanning of the prints, which are costly endeavors for film archives, especially when one can be assured of the final product. So this might explain why samples of Eugène-Augustin Laoste sound prints have received little attention in comparison. So to my knowledge, the prints of Laoste's sound experiment in the Doublier collection are one of the most important collection of Laoste's sound experiment to still existing, and it would be fascinating to hear what they have to say. So here on screen, you have a sample of some of the artifacts that are preserved from Laoste here in the Doublier collection. Those are not preserved, but the moving image department is hoping to preserve them soon. On the left, you have only sound, and in the middle, you have Laoste sound and scene technique that he patented in the 1910s. And on the right, I'm not sure, it's another version of the sound and scene, but it's a variable density soundtrack, not a variable area soundtrack. I'm no expert on early film sound. There is a lot of research to be done with this film print to determine exactly which process he was using and if there were experiments. I'm not even sure that they are all Laoste, but since they were all together, it is highly probable. On the right here, you can see it is Laoste with his sound recording machine on the little square frame on the right. But it's still one of the fascinating objects of this collection are definitely the early sound films. Another interesting thing that Doublier was collecting were the travelogues. He definitely, after all these travels, still kept an interest for travel films and for newsreels too. What I like about some of the nitrate travelogues found in this part of the collection is that they also link him to Auclair. I found a duplicate, for example, of this film on the right, La Vie aux Indes. It was a series filmed by Auclair in 1912. It's a very beautiful film. And on the left here, it's a film unidentified but shot in the Swiss Alps. And on edges, you have the inscription René Moreau, who was also working for Auclair at the time. So I wonder if some of those prints are also a way to link here Doublier's career with Auclair. And that would be a good testimony because we really don't have a lot about his laboratory career and his career in the American studios. And to conclude, the most consistent aspect of this collection is the presence of duplicates and multiple versions of films, marking his identity as a lab worker. This also makes his collection more vulnerable and difficult to comprehend because archives are not necessarily interested in owning multiple incomplete copies of a title when they have an original print or a negative. However, understood together, those duplicates point to a very sensible aspect of his work. They are the prints he processed and projected. In a risk of fetishizing this last aspect, the prints as a direct link to Doublier's past, I would like to argue that the duplicate prints make visible one phenomenon of film collecting, duping, and the traces of individuals to be written into film history, the presence of the lab worker behind the printing machine. Thank you very much. I would also like to take the time to thank pretty much all the moving image department who has really helped me throughout this research since I was a Selznick student, first at Stratman that we miss a lot, Deb Stoiber, Nancy Kaufman, Sophia Laurent, Liana Kroll, Sam Lane, Gordon Nelson, and Peter Bagroff. So thank you very much.
Hey, Clara, thank you for presenting. We've got a lot of good questions here. I'd like to start with Vanessa Scherer's question. Vanessa asks, I would like to know if the Doublier collection is the center of your doctoral thesis, and if so, if you could kindly share your leading question and thesis with us.
The Doublier collection is one chapter of my thesis. So I work on the memory and the history of the French film communities. I've been working in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And the Doublier collection kind of starts this investigation because it was working on this collection that I uncovered this kind of network of people, and I started to become interested in how they work together. And I'm really interested in how they narrated their own history, if you will, because we have little documents to work from. So I work on Francis Doublier, asking those questions, really question of archival questions. I work on Alice Guy Blaché, and I work then on decorator Henri Ménessier and Ben Carré, and the archive that Musée Dora and Anne Carré's built about them.
Great, thank you. So there's two questions that are similar. I'm going to start with one, but then the second one will kind of be a follow-up to that.
Okay.
If you don't already answer the second one in the first one. So Aurore Spires said, "Hi, Clara. You mentioned that Louise Doublier helped her husband throughout his life. Were you able to find out more about her possible involvement in the early film industry? Was she ever credited by Doublier? I'm wondering mainly because the labor performed by wives and other female family members so often goes unnoticed and undocumented."
Yes, well, the short answer is no. I don't know, and I really don't know how much she did either, because, I mean, the letter I showed too about writing Eugène Laoste, written by Eugène Laoste to Louise Doublier, shows that at least they were maintaining a lot of the social circles in this French film community, at least. But I really don't know because I haven't found anything. And in the papers, there is also very little about her. There are photographs, but not so much. Because again, this is another aspect of my work, is to study a little bit how this archival collection is constructed. The papers that the family donated to the museum are chosen. They're always linked to one aspect of his life, and they also kept a lot in the family archive. And so it's difficult to also see what's there. But I agree with you. That's why I also do this genealogical research, and I try to research the network of people having worked in Fort Lee, because a lot of female workers actually came to work in the laboratories, and we don't have traces of their work. But Louise Doublier didn't, at least from all the census papers that I've seen, didn't work directly with her husband.
Yeah. So you may have kind of already answered the next question. Melinda Wallington was asking, or had stated, women workers are incredibly challenging to locate in business records. Have you found some companies have more records regarding women workers, or is this an across-the-board gap in the historical record? What sorts of jobs did women do, if we know?
Yeah, well, that I didn't. First, there are not that many company records from this era in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Pathé in France have an incredible industrial archive, and where there are actually a lot of women workers, but and who work, in the laboratories. And I actually have Doublier's sisters. One of them was bookkeeper, and another was, sorry, I just have to find my note. A manager of manufacturing plates, another sister. So a wide range of different professions. And actually, I am in contact with people who have researched some of their ancestors, having also worked for Pathé in New Jersey. And we found that Pathé sent a lot of female workers to trained American female workers, apparently, on the Pathé plant in Brunswick, New Jersey. And they were actually recognized for their career too. And they were also working in laboratories.
Cool. Let's see here. So Linda Keenan had asked, why do you think there were fragments and not complete films? You know, obviously, and then Linda followed up by saying, you know, his purpose was to use samples, but is there any other use for the fragments?
It's really hard to answer because sometimes, I mean, he might have kept full prints, but we only have fragments because parts are decomposed and have been taken from the original print. So for example, the travelogues that I've shown, they're often incomplete because part of them were decomposed and taken out by archivists, so it wouldn't decompose, so the whole film wouldn't decompose. So about fragments, it's hard to know if he was only collecting fragments. That's a question that I haven't investigated, because a lot of the fiction films that he collected are almost only fragments. So I don't know if they were like an educational collection, and it's difficult to do conjunctures when you don't have a lot to build from. But yeah, one hypothesis for me is like he was using them as to show the early days of film, like to do film demonstrations, like really a teaching collection. It's how I interpret it, but it's also difficult to know for sure.
Yeah. Well, Clara, thank you so much for sharing your research with us and your knowledge. You know, as I was kind of saying in the beginning, as I was introducing, you know, this series is really about giving our audiences a behind the scenes glimpse at often maybe unknown things going on at the museum. And I think I just, like, even me personally, who, you know, I've been at the museum for a little over 10 years, like, and I knew very little about this collection, even being at the museum for that long. So it's always, I always appreciate when I get these really great deep dive, unique perspectives into things that are under the roof of the place that I'm at almost every single day. So I really appreciate it. I know our audience appreciates it. And thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank
we
you.
will send the recording of this out to you in about a week. And check our online calendar for future programs. Take care, everyone.